Hello, selectors, and welcome back to the Life First podcast. I'm Andrew, and today we're doing one of our top 8 interviews here, and I'm joined with Wilson. Hi, Wilson. Why don't you introduce yourself?
Hey, my name is Wilson. I participated in the Las Vegas Grand Prix for Wixoss 2024. I came in fourth place, semifinalist, and first seed after Swiss rounds was completed.
Yeah, you were my only loss in the tournament. It happened, and I was like, well, there goes my seeding.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah, I recall that game. That was a close game. I'm pretty happy with my performance overall.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it would be. You were 6-1, and even the game that you lost was at the last round and was also very, very tight. So,
Oh
I
yeah, though I think it was a close game. I dissected it a little bit, but again, very happy with how I played in that game and in the tournament overall. And yep, still very proud about that.
Well, let's get right into it. So you took up a little break from the game, if I remember correctly. You were one of the better players that I played against in sort of the early first year of Wecross.
Hmm.
But you came back and you're I mean hitting the ground running clearly, top four at GP Vegas with the Ange Burst deck. Tell me about it. Tell me about how you got back into Wecross and why you settled on this one.
Yeah, I definitely took a bit of a break, but when I saw that it was coming back to Vegas, I it's a nice short flight for me from where I am. I am from Vancouver, British Columbia, in Canada,
Mm.
so that's something that I considered. I like nice, easy airplane flights, but the current set and meta interested me, but I was also interested in the um, virtual release that came out as well, the Niji Sanji newest set for that. So I was interested in seeing how that would pair up against the current Desona decks.
Yeah, and I mean, you did this one very, very well. In my testing, I was finding that Ange was actually a particularly strong deck. So my thought was when I was playing Miko, I was like, all right, I think there's two decks that I don't do super well against. They're Ange Burst Rush and Tama Mono White with like maybe a double blue thing going on. I don't think the second one will show up very much. I'm hoping no good players will play Ange Burst Rush. And then here you were playing Ange Burst Rush, and I was like, well, there goes that thought.
Yeah, I playtested a homebrew variety with a lot of folklores and two stops using Burst Rush, trying to get like a really greedy three stop.
Hmm.
But I found the deck was just too slow, so I looked up some other varieties and found that Japanese players really favored Moon Knight.
Hmm.
And after playtesting, I did understand that variant better and how it pushes for damage a lot faster and just closes out games before the Dishonor engine really gets going.
Yeah, and it's worth mentioning that one thing that I was finding when I was doing the Miko testing was that Disona is actually quite a greedy resource deck. Like it uses resources quite a bit. So the fact that you're bouncing helps deny resources there, and then the Moonlight on top of it for the mill out refresh also denies resources, right?
Yeah, another reason I really like Ange is I used to be a big Hirina player.
Hmm.
Recall I had like a particular homebrew with Hirina and Adamantia
Yep.
in one of the early ceremonies. So the one split game is very similar, but I enjoy the fact that Ange has built-in removal in her action and collab livers.
Hmm.
So I thought her playstyle would really suit me.
Yeah, I mean clearly it did. And so I gotta agree with you on your Elrig deck here. This is basically the same exact Elrig deck that I was testing with and hoping no one was gonna play here. But for the audience to see this upgraded version of Ange, the last time we've seen Ange was at the last GP. It managed two of them managed to top 8, but I don't think they really were reaching their final form. This feels solid when I saw you playing and going through the turns. Could you talk a little bit about the card choices specifically for the Elrig deck?
Yeah, so one of my big choices was which Black Elric to bring. I was a little bit torn between Toko and I was playtesting some Maho Maho
Hmm.
assist lines, but the value of having a pay one removal and pay one to grab a white signet from trash just felt invaluable in a pretty discard heavy meta, especially with Unrest floating around.
Hmm.
Other changes I made was upping the number of Chigusas. So again, I had more top deck options. Again, very important when you're being brought down to 0 cards pretty often.
Yep.
Um, and then Burst Rush, the way Burst Rush adds to the deck, I find, is it gives you a lot of free removal if you hit it.
Hmm.
That just leads into your turn 3 really nicely, where you have the end to spend for the Chigusa swings. You are putting your opponent lower on Enter and Life Cloth and pressuring their assist out earlier. Um, and it just gives you a lot of Enter to work with without having to use Enter for other normal assist lines.
That makes sense to me. A question I might have for our viewers is you're using a level 1 Toko removal, which I completely agree with, right? Sometimes this deck hits a level 2 and it doesn't really have a good way to remove the level 2 like on the turn 2, and Toko is the solution for that. But with Eldora Searcher, you usually don't get a ton of hand fixing, right? Like a lot of these older Ange decks were sometimes even using Madoka to basically dig 3 deep to fix their opening hands. How did you dance around the opening hand situation?
Um, I skip my first and sometimes second enter phase very often, so I would hold on to more cards in hand to make sure I have a place for level 2. Um, in certain matchups, I would also um, just be ready to use after school the first relay piece
Hmm.
to search, especially for those totals for that early momentum for removal.
Hmm.
That's another reason why I think the Toku assist line is so important, is that the minus 8,000 level 1 assist will usually hit the level 2. And it's uncommon for opponents to do use more than 1 or 2 level 2s on their field on that turn,
Hmm.
mainly because there's so many aggressive level 1s right now, like Firecracker and Wild Wolf. So you do get a lot of value out of total overall. But if there is level 2, or if there's another level 1 that you can't quite get, you always have that one assist to back it up to make sure that you have something open.
Hmm. Yeah, it makes total sense. Look, the best Disona level 2s are the 5,000 powered level 1s, right? And those are you're able to get rid of. There's ways to get rid of those things. So yeah, it makes sense that the Toko level 1 is sort of like key to that plan. So you're saying that you were pretty unafraid of using after school early if you need to fix your opening hand.
Especially, very much depends on the matchup and if my opponent appears to be or has used their pieces early, especially unrest.
Hmm.
Usually, once that big discard piece is out of the way, you have a little bit more freedom to fill up your hand. The only exceptions to that maybe being the Miko matchup, considering how much discard she's packing.
Yeah, it makes sense to me. Another tech that I was seeing you use, and honestly, I didn't think about it, but it seemed incredibly strong, was so you're running for Elira, right? And so
Yeah.
a lot of things I've seen you do is play Elira, top check, either bottom deck it or keep it on top, and then you use Eldora immediately afterwards, often drawing the card that you put on top.
So there's a little bit of basically rigging I'm doing to my deck,
Hmm.
especially in preparation for the Eldora Search and Burst Rush, where if I'm not particularly mindful on needing a specific card, I'll try to filter out non-bursts of the deck by drawing them, or even putting them to bottom and then trashing them through Machida Chima's ability.
Oh.
Because I figure that every single non-burst I take out of the deck is just a slight increase in my chances with Burst Rush, which I did have very good fortune with throughout the tournament. So I do think that those small advantages do add up a lot.
No, I think you're actually onto something there too. That's something I didn't even consider. Was um, because Burst Rush, let's say, I don't know, has an 80% hit rate. Every time that you can maximize that, that means that Burst Rush, which is normally considered something that doesn't have a great consistency round after round after round, if you maximize that, then that changes that number, which I mean works. You got to round 7 maximizing it quite well.
Absolutely. And Eldora Searcher is one of the unique assists in that it has two enter effects. And because you can choose the order in which you process those, you may as well make maximum use of that by either drawing if you know that what the card on top is, or searching first to even adding like a total from your life cloth back into the deck can still increase your deck quality because that's removal that's in the deck now and not a non-burst in your life cloth.
Yeah, totally makes sense to me. Um, and then speaking of you saying putting something on the bottom and then milling it out, right? I do know that the other deck that I think you had a little bit of success with was also Team Lion back in the day too, right? So is that a little like Lion-esque knowledge, like knowing the order of your library and working with it?
Yep. So the line deck back then, you definitely filter through all of your deck very heavily, both in the original version where you're just running endless punchline,
Hmm.
where you're definitely filtering out your deck. Um, it is kind of that style of being mindful of what cards are currently in your deck and what your current options are and what your outs are,
Hmm.
because it just helps you know what your chances are of drawing into your deck or what options are out. Um, it's just being mindful of um, basically your game state.
Yeah, makes sense. So Eldora Burst Rush, last question on Eldora Burst Rush here, uh, was how often did it did it miss? Did it not miss very often? I remember against us, it on our first play match, which was round 6, hit immediately, screwed me, and then on the semifinals, it missed, but then immediately hit afterwards on my second attack. So it basically did the same amount of damage and life
Yep,
saving that
I
it would
recall
normally.
our judge shuffled for me, and the second life cloth that we flipped was Fear and Slash at the time.
Hmm. Hmm.
So again, I had excellent luck with Burst Rush throughout the entirety of the Grand Prix. Um, I don't recall missing one, but that's within the first two life bursts. You basically get two chances for two stop if assuming your opponent's opening 3 lanes,
Yeah.
where you get the first crush, and then you shuffle and you put the top cloth into, or you top your top card into your life cloth.
Hmm.
And then even if you miss that first crush, you have one more chance when they crush the next card for it to still bounce to, trash to, or just block to.
Hmm.
So it's much better than you think. And if you add Searcher on top of that, you really are getting 3 chances at hitting a burst, where normally you would just get one with any other assist line, essentially.
Yeah, and I guess with this deck specifically, it like you said, the only way that it really doesn't super do well is if the opponent is only, I guess, opening up a single lane. In which case, you could just not burst rush in the first place. You could just wait for it. And also, if
Yeah.
they're not pushing damage, I mean, that's sort of almost like spelling out doom for them too, because I mean, you've got a clock in this deck for sure.
Desona did feel quite fast and aggressive. I felt like it was a more 3 lane open kind of dynamic than previous sets.
Hmm.
So I think Burst Rush definitely has a lot more value because of that, where you're taking more damage, but you're getting more chances at getting that value out of your life bursts.
Yeah, and Burst Rush also sort of forces you to play bursts that are good. And if you're in an open 3 format, bursts that are good also inevitably help you because just even on their natural bursting is a good move, which I guess transitions us quite nicely into the main deck. So let's talk about your main deck. What do you like on here? What were some adaptations that you put in here that you particularly enjoy? What worked? What didn't? Go ahead. This is your time.
So the one copy of Kokoro I think is really important because it is essentially a fifth servant
Hmm.
in the deck. Any option to vary the number of servants that you have access to can throw a lot of opponents' offense off. Um, it's harder to do that against very hard discard decks, but again, unless I'm up against Miko Miko, usually Unrest is the big discard moment.
Hmm.
And after that, you still have some chances to keep some cards or even servants in hand after.
Hmm.
Um, the other addition I made was flashcards instead of Over Pursuit.
Hmm.
Um, I found Over Pursuit. I didn't really need the Ena refund from its effect where you have a full field of white Signy, but oftentimes minusing the one card from using a spell is pretty negative against the discard matchup.
Hmm.
So I just wanted to find an equivalent of a fifth total to put in the deck. Um, it does decrease a little bit of the virtual synergy, but just having the one copy didn't affect that too much, so I was quite happy to add that card in. Um, I definitely think Fort Gigas is important because one of the big advantages of the virtual Nijisanji deck list is the option to attack twice even after you've downed your entire Signy field if you have a full field of virtuals. So that increase in damage potential is a big deal. I want to make sure I have access to that at all times. So Fort Gigas was very important.
Yeah, and I assume, like you said earlier, the card filtering is actually quite important too, and card advantage. You get kind of all of them in Chigusa.
Yeah, not to mention it just increases your top deck options.
Hmm.
Because if you're discarded to zero and you draw two and you get a Chigusa, you get another option to draw into more virtuals or even another Chigusa if you really need to fill up your board. Sheena does the same thing, in fact, where it's another great top deck option. Um, where if you're in that position and because Ange doesn't draw any cards inherently and only one of two pieces generates any resources, you really want those options to refresh your hand mid match.
Sure, sure, sure. Yeah, that makes totally sense to me. And that's kind of a question I have for you too. Is I have always struggled with figuring out exactly what level threes Signy the Ange deck wants to field, which is cool. I mean, it's cool that it's spoiled for choice here. But you opted for outside of the four Chigusa, which I think most people would agree with. You did opt for three Sheena, which I don't think a lot of people would go after. I've seen lists with two and one, and sometimes even zero. How come three for this card?
Um, Part of it is the burst. I think the trash burst is a fair deal more powerful than the bounce burst.
Hmm.
One thing I was worried about like, going up against Desona decks is their ability to turn their hand into Enter through either Ivy, Desona, or Emergence, where you're not really denying them as well because they have that flexibility of um, balancing their Enter and hand.
Hmm.
Whereas Trash will just take that resource out right away. It's not in their hand, it's not in their Enter, it's not in the field, it's in the trash.
Hmm.
Um, the other aspect is I find Shina is quite useful against the Nanashi deck list, which I know did quite well in the tournament as well,
Hmm.
where that boost does just force out some extra resources, as well as Pure Luke. Pure Luke? Yeah, the Pure Luke center also has a minus once per game
Hmm.
that Sheena just becomes more extra annoying for them to deal with at that point.
Yeah, I do think I agree with you. I think if there's any time for Shooting to shine, it would be right now, right? Like Miko Miko is a real deck and strips cards from hand, so Sheena being able to fix your top deck as well as potentially get you cards, or even cycle cards is pretty good. But I mean, this is the meta of Firecracker, the meta of Musica, the Signies, and the meta of viruses, and then the plus 3,000 does a lot to just make a lot of those threats unkillable, right? It takes 5,000s, turns them to 8,000. Suddenly, those things aren't dying to the most popular card in the set, Firecracker, and it takes your 2Ks and turns them into 5Ks against the virtuals, or sorry, the virus matchup, and that, I mean, then they have to waste extra resources like Musica to kill off your level ones or something, which is resources wasted on the Nanashi matchup means, and you're already denying resources, means that they've got very little to work with later down the line.
Yeah, and this deck does do quite well at putting up pretty large walls. So um, another thing is outdoor burst. I usually favored using that quite early in the game to gain access to the 7 limit. So having a 3-1-3 board is really important both for activating Chigusa, but also just having access to the other effects. There's actually not that many 3-1-3 combos in the deck available. There's Chigusa Furin, Chigusa Finana, Chigusa Kokoro, and Chigusa Fina.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, Chigusa Shina. Um, so keeping in mind of what field I think is best against the opponent. I do think that the Sheena Chigusa is just really solid overall at threatening the most damage, but also setting up a strong board for the opponent to have to deal with the next turn.
You bring up a good point here. A lot of the top players would talk about their what their turn 3, turn 4, turn 5, or whatever it looks like, and have specific cards in mind. They're saying these are the things I'm trying to hit. So you're basically saying at all points in times, turn 3, turn 4, turn 5 doesn't matter. You're trying to put out Chigasas on the board.
Absolutely. Even if I'm up against a very common assist line, which was X Crossfire, throwing the cheeks out early usually forces that option out early,
Mm-hmm.
rather than having to deal with it later. And if they hang on to it, then you just don't get to throw in that extra damage later unless you get it out now.
Yep. Okay, so you said, I think I was hearing you correctly here, but correct me if I'm wrong here, that you wanted to pair your Chigusa mostly with Sheena. But what were the other when would you play out the other pairs with it and why?
So it's interesting in that I didn't field fearing all that much throughout this tournament, and yet it's still really important. What's important about Fearing is that it enables Fear and Slash to be used as a spell for 2 costs instead of the usual 5,
Mm-hmm.
which is a really important removal option when Ange's um, action can only bounce 12k or less. So having that larger bounce, effectively a white fireball, is really important to the deck just as an out against specific fields, Midoriko or Mel centers, things like atoms that came up, in fact.
Hmm.
Um, it's also just a really strong burst in itself, but just the fact that it also has its use as a um, there's very few spell immune signies in the format, especially now.
Mm-hmm.
So Fear and Slash is very, very reliable removal.
Got it. Yeah. So that's basically it's a top end you didn't want to have to use, but was there as a emergency button almost.
Yeah, it is relevant in the resource generation, and I can give you back an enter or a card.
Mm-hmm.
Again, usually enter is in a really good spot because of how cost effective Burst Rush is. Basically, an effective +1 enter on top of whatever burst you get from the life cloth itself.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, and so at that point, my main concern is just making sure I have hand size to play out the game and for threaten 3 lanes each turn, along with Chigusa if possible.
Right, that makes total sense to me. So, let's also. We've briefly talked about Toto just being an important key in the deck. Clearly, you've got 4 of it, and you wanted a 5th copy. It opens a lane. I don't think anyone would deny the power of Toto here, but you've got a bunch of level 1s, right? And that's something I think a lot of people struggle with is which specific level 1s to use in the Ange deck. It looks like you opted for, outside of Elora, more defensive level 1s. Do you want to talk about those a little bit?
Yeah, I've always considered Sorohoshi Kurame as one of the strongest openers
Mm-hmm.
in the game for multiple reasons. One, she's obviously a really strong wall. She is, well, there's another virtual on the field, gains plus 2000 and shadow level 1, which just straight up blocks all level 1 assist lines from most Elrics.
Hmm.
Um, Another important thing about her that I really enjoy is that she is, of course, a non-life burst card. So it feels really good to have her in your mulligan or post mulligan
Hmm.
because again, you're increasing that burst quality just from the very first stage of the game. Um, what I also found is really important is that she combos really well with Machida Chima, and that Soroboshi and Chima combined. If you get the Chima's enter effective proc where you trash your bond card in your deck, if it's virtual, it gains plus 5,000. Fielding that with Soroboshi gives them both immunity to Firecracker, especially. And
Hmm.
Firecracker is like threat number one in the opening first turns of the game. So any options that snuffs that out is really powerful.
Yeah. Here's the question: how often did you get the fabled? Did you get the fabled 12K or even 17K Chima?
Um, I found I reliably had access to it. I missed a couple because there's still servants and Fear and Slashers and the one copy of Flash card in the deck, so it's definitely not a 100% reliable option.
Right.
And if you field in Lilia to try and rig it, then Lilia herself is vulnerable unless you trash it from field, which I am loath to do in a discard meta. So it didn't come up as often, especially after the first one or two turns. It just becomes um, less annoying for the opponent to deal with once they have access to the level 2 and level 3 Signies,
Hmm.
their actions, their pieces, and the rest of their assist line. Especially against Crossfire, I find Crossfire kind of limits its usefulness because it's a very easy Crossfire target.
Yeah.
Um, so I could make a big Chima, but sometimes it just wasn't the right play at the time.
Yeah.
Um, what I find one of its other most important timings, other than the beginning of the game, is also towards the end of the game when you're trying to close out the game.
Hmm.
If you combine it with Shina and Chigusa, you can potentially buff Chima into a range where it's harder for certain bursts to deal with, such as the 8K or less burst,
Hmm.
or the Lalaru Vanish of 12K or less burst. Chima can put herself out of that range if you combine her with Sheena and her own ability.
That makes sense. I had a one of my locals. He's always fishing for the biggest Chima he possibly can get, and he got the fabled I think 17K one. He was on like round 5 I think is what it was. He was in the table next to me. And he like pointed it out. He hit Chima 3 times off of the off of the ability. And it was his like first time he's ever done it. And he plays virtuals a lot in our locals.
Yeah, it definitely has a lot of stickiness if you get it to go off, but you also have to be aware of your opponent's options of can they just unrest it? Do they have
Yeah.
a level 1 assist that just targets level 1s anyway, since it has no shadow resistances to that. So I find it's most useful early in the game
Hmm.
for filtering and for trying to close out the game if you're trying to build a board that can fight through some of your opponent's last life bursts.
Got it. Yeah, that makes sense to me. And then Finana here is only a 2 of. I've seen lists, at least at the last GP, that was like trying to rep them as much as a 4 of, maybe even sticking in Remember to basically be an off-brand Finana. But you're only repping 2 here. Why is that?
Um, Again, I find that I need to be really picky with what 313 board I'm running.
Hmm.
The Fina definitely is useful for the one colorless enter tax that it applies for guarding
Hmm.
to the opponent, um, which I find is most relevant when closing out the game. Usually before the final rounds of the game, there's a little bit more flexibility of paying or not paying for guards um, or even just having more enter available at that stage.
Yeah.
But it's really in the final like last legs of the game that the number of enter that you have left is really important because you can either afford you can either afford your defensive options or you can't. And Fina just kind of tweaks the math a little bit on how much energy your opponent needs to survive, especially against Mel Invisible, which has been very popular throughout this tournament as a super powerful defensive three stop.
Yeah, it has
Uh,
been, and that does change the math a little bit for Finana. The other thing I think too is there's a distinct less amount of what do you call it, of things like Super Celestia Saber. It's like certain guard recursion cards, so it's just more often that you're gonna hit the opponent. They just won't have a guard. And I say this knowing full well that the Nanashi matchup, however, runs 8 bursts, and all of those can get guards. You know, even with the partner signet can get guards.
yes. So it's most relevant when your opponent has a guard and when they need to guard,
Hmm.
which again is usually towards the end of the game. But it did come up for once in a while as a one enter tax, which does matter. Enter is very important in this current set because of mainly invisible
Hmm.
is one of the biggest enter sinks in the game for most players because they have to just budget for that while balancing their own offense.
Hmm. Makes sense. Makes sense. Okay, well, we talked quite a bit about the main deck here, so let's talk about some of your rounds here. I mean, you went 6-1, which is very, very good. You only got defeated at the last round, out of all things, when you've already tied up top seeding and top 8, and then you made it all the way to top 4. Let's go ahead and chat about your rounds. How did they go?
Um, sh- so I remember my first two rounds pretty well because I played against some pretty unique, um, less orthodox centers. The
Yeah.
first one being a Madoka, which I was pretty I thought was pretty spooky considering Monica X's enter effects,
Hmm.
discarding or freezing Elric, which is a big deal when I'm trying to push Chigusas as well as my once per game. Um, it was actually a Adams deck, which was a blast to play against. My opponent was great, had a lot of fun, um, but um, the deck did perform very well against the Adams package because of one, it's pretty geared towards discard matchups already, as well as having a lot of removal options, including removal options during my opponent's attack phase when
Yep.
it's more vulnerable. So that definitely came up. The final round or the final turn, I pushed for game because I knew my opponent was low or out of servants,
Hmm.
and I was able to clear the board of H2Os by main phase growing my Toko assist.
Hmm.
Um, I main phase grew Toko, blanked the H2O with an Alira, and then used my my once per turn, not once per turn, but my action collab liver cost to bounce it after blanking at minus 12 it the H2O.
Hmm.
So um, it was a good game, but I did have some outs against H2O. Some decks just can't deal with H2O,
Yep.
but there's just this deck does have the tools for it.
Yeah, you're pretty fearless with that that main phase grow Toko. You've done it. You did it in both our games, I remember, which I was like, oh, that was cool. But yeah, go on. How did round 2 go after that?
Round two, I was up against. Um, I believe this was a Milaloon center
Cool.
because I remember that they were on Disona, but I remember just having to try and recall Amelia's Center's ability, which is the search top 10, grab spells to play for free, as well as making spells more expensive, which I don't particularly mind.
Hmm.
It was interesting thinking about what they built their deck to be good against, which I think is mainly the Pure matchup, as well as Disona in general has a lot of really good spells and extra and emergence.
Yep.
Um, but um, again, I was pretty well equipped for discard. I ended up milling them out, and they were end up using a lot of trouble spells, looking for servants from their deck,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
um, which um, did limit their enter options later on. But yeah, servants is really important for my strategy because of again Chigusa as well as my once per game. I just kind of pressure my opponents on their servants in hand much
Hmm.
more often. And on top of that, I found in a lot of my very more fortunate matchups, my opponents just didn't have good to great servant draw, which this deck just punishes a lot harder than usual because of its two attacks per turn.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, it makes sense. I think Milulin's a cool deck, but I think it has pretty lopsided matchups. It's fairly good against these non non-interactive decks that aren't really pressuring you on time either, and it being the aggro, and then pretty okay at the pressuring sort of these discard decks to like out discard them, outdraw them, but then it needs a lot of resources. So it's both resource hungry and wants to be the faster deck, which I don't think it is against Ange on either of those.
Yeah, but I understand the reasoning behind it, which is targeting your opponent's spells while playing spells of your own and
Mhm.
trying to generate a card hand advantage through that.
Cool. And moving on to round three, what did you end up playing against?
Um, Round three is where some of my memory starts to fail me because then I started to play more standard um Elric decks and setups.
Yeah.
Round four, I believe, was where I ran into the Alpha player that who also made it into top eight,
Yep.
Alexander.
Mm-hmm.
So that matchup, I was fortunate enough to have play tested a little bit against the deck and even examined the deck list. I understood its game plan as soon as I saw the Ulrich that my opponent was running, which was, of course, Alpha Center, Umaru Assist, which is definitely on clear to um, force out early mill out,
Mm-hmm.
deck out, and then the standard Mel Invisible as the big defensive option.
Yep.
But I understand the game plan of trying to eliminate your opponent's key cards and then walling up with a mix of Disona as well as Exia cards.
Mm-hmm.
Um, in my testing, my opponent immediately target all of my Chigosaus out of my trash, which was um, very powerful.
Mm-hmm.
But my opponent gave me the advice of put Chigusa into the enter where it can't be as easily interacted with at all by Dishonored unless they're running some kind of enter burn, which they were not.
Yeah. Yeah. It makes sense there. Yeah, that's a safe zone for it for sure.
It is like the one safe zone because if it's in hand, it gets cleared. If it's in trash, it gets milled. If it's in your deck, it gets milled.
Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah, and I mean, if you play it, it gets vanished, which is means it ends up in the safe zone of that enter. Then yeah, makes sense. Um, all right, then I think the next round was round five, and that was against me, right? Yeah.
Yep. I recall that you were not able to grow at one part of the game when you paid
No.
for the Ange cost. Um, so that was definitely a big boon for me, considering I was up against Miko Miko, and Miko Miko really benefits from being level 3 and starting that resource denial.
Mm-hmm.
So that was very fortunate. I, of course, hit a good burst rush that game. And then just once I knew I had the damage and my opponent was low on servants, I pushed for the finishing hit at the end using, of course, Chigusa.
Yeah, I intercharged a lot of servants that game. Yeah, it was a bit of a weird one because like I was pressured, but at the same time my enter wasn't quite flowing out the colors I needed them to be. So there was a scenario where I had to try to keep pace like while also being defensive. So I valued opening rather than color, and I didn't, and also quantity of enter. So I didn't grow on my turn three, and I was able to have I had the enter then to do the defense, but it still didn't work out. It still fell apart on me.
It was an interesting game because of that decision to risk not growing, which in the end you weren't able to grow because of the um, ender distribution in your deck. Um, but it was still pretty close because Miko Miko is very threatening in
Hmm.
her ability to just lock out your hand and consistently get that one Elric swing on face without any servants or guards possible.
Yeah, and I will say between the both of our matches that we played at the GP, I have to commend you for being constantly patient with the and not getting greedy about like trying to go for the kill, right? Like that's something that I found a lot of the aggro players against me would be like, oh, my hand's being pressured, I have to push, and you would be like, no, I don't need to push right now. It's gonna be the same if I push next turn. So you would take your time on the stuff and not let my resource destroying like really catch you off guard. Like you had your abilities to keep moving forward throughout the game, not push now and then be screwed on later turns. Basically, what I'm saying. So I'm commending you on that one as well.
Thank you. Um,
Um, and then following that, you went into round 6, right? Or no,
yes.
maybe I was round 6, and then there was a different one, round 5. I can't remember off the top of my head.
Yeah, round five was around when I got to the table one for the exhibition table.
Yep.
So yeah, I believe I spent three of the rounds there for Swiss. One was definitely against yourself. I believe one was against a Look player,
Yes,
and then the
that
last
would have
one
been
was
maybe Rue.
against a Mayu deck list.
Mm-hmm, 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 mm-hmm. That's it exactly. So I think Rue was on the Pure Luke that you must have played on round 5. How did that match go? Was that did that feel different than Miko?
So Luke is um, just has constant access to spells in her trash,
Yep.
as well as the insane value that is the save, the her specific dishonor.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so again, still a very discard heavy deck by playing those extras, pawn turtles and unrest. Um, I can disrupt that game plan a little bit by using Moon Knight to deck them out,
Mm-hmm.
but I find that if they have some save in hands, they're pretty quick to fill up their hand and trash again with spells.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so it's nothing particularly, there's no particular advantage or disadvantage against Pure Look versus other blue centers. So my strategy is still the same. I prefer to spend Anges once per game,
Mm-hmm.
um, early to again force out enter or servants,
Mm-hmm.
and then I'm just constantly counting servants to assess how much damage I can push or um, versus how much life lock they have. And invisible is always one of the biggest hurdles in most deck lists, but especially the um, the big the Nanashi list, Pure Look and Miko Miko. I believe all three of those run invisible.
Yep.
So my strategy to count invisible is to pressure their enter by spending OPG early and bouncing as much as possible,
Mm-hmm.
as well as just trying to grind out servants every single turn
Mm-hmm.
to increase my damage potential for the final push.
Gotcha. So that was your round 5. Then your round 6 was against me, and then round 7 was Taylor with Black Tama Mayu. How did that last one go?
Yes, so that was definitely a very unique deck list. Um, the Mayu deck did we did roll dice and they went first, which is a pretty big advantage for Mayu decks since they get the they're growing first. They get access to level twos and level
Mm-hmm.
threes earlier. Um, One unfortunate thing is during their first attack phase, they open all three lanes. I unfortunately did not have a servant in hand,
Mm-hmm.
and they did not hit any bursts, so and I ended up taking 4 damage that turn. So I was down to 3 life cloth right away against a
Yeah.
Maya deck, which is pretty devastating, especially knowing that they tend to run Orzo and plan to mill out one more
hmm
life cloth.
So
So
basically, the situation was you where you put everyone else. You're suddenly like, oh, this is terrible.
yeah, pretty heavy disadvantage, and I didn't even have a chance to burst rush because I'm going second, of course.
hmm
Um, and then from there, I just um, still proceeded with the standard game plan, but I knew my time was very limited
Yep.
because of that lack of an early guard and life burst.
hmm
So um, they another unique thing is that they're running Urith Aura as their assist line,
hmm
where when their Elric swings, they will trash up to 2 of the Signia on the field and add 2 non-life burst cards to the life cloth.
hmm
So going into my turn 2, I was at 3 cloth. My opponent was on 8 cloth, which was kind of unfortunate.
hmm
Um, so
Yeah,
pretty disadvantaged at that point,
and
but I played the
and
rest
that
of
one
the
can
best I
be
could.
pretty annoying too because if you even in situations where you're able to basically pull off the mill following that, you often will hit the the Urith thing that put on that has been regrown from the life cloth, which won't have life burst, right? You won't be getting effectively the best mill that you could possibly there.
Yeah, it was my turn 2, so I did just swing into it with my Signia. I think I was able to open 3,
hmm
but even then, getting the 3 damage off, I was still pretty low on life off myself, and um, I felt that because they could just grow into Mayu when it's time for their final push, my
hmm
chances were not looking great at that point. Even though I did get the full burst rush,
Yep.
I just didn't have enough defensive options to really extend the game past their kill turn.
Yeah. Well, even with that, you managed to become the you were 6-1, but you were first seed, so you got first place up to that point. Going into top 8, that was good. It means that at that point you were always going first if that's what you wanted. And you played who against in your first round of top 8?
Yep, quarterfinals, I was up against the Alpha deck again, Alexander.
hmm
So I felt pretty good going into that game, both because I had the advantage of choosing to go first, as well as just previous matchup knowledge against Alpha of putting Chickasaws into Enter.
hmm
Um, that game went pretty well overall. Um, After they had used Umur Clear and used it once per game, 2 of my Chickasaws were safely in my hand, so I knew that I had access to those 2 Elric swings each turn,
hmm
and I was in a good position most of that game throughout. Clear does delay Ange's Elric swings, especially it can delay once per game an extra turn. So that was something I was conscious of. But I had a good burst rush, and my bursts were over pretty favored, so I still had enough life cloth to keep myself healthy until I need to swing for game.
Cool. Yeah, that makes sense to me. And then the final game that you had was in top 4. That one was against me. How did you? How was your point of view for it?
So I chose to go first, of course. Um, I remember that my first attack phase, you blessed. I watched you very carefully, like do a ritual with your life bursts, and it paid off because you hit Amiko Oshi on top, which freezes my Elric, which is again very relevant against a Chigusa deck. And then you also hit a extra type life burst. I think it was specifically off of a Milaloon
hmm
level 2
hmm
that has the target Assignia or Elrig and disable this attack unless they discard 3. I did have 5 cards at that time, so I could have paid for it if I wanted to, but I didn't want to put myself at such a big hand disadvantage so early in the game.
I think that was
Um,
correct. I think if you did that early in the game, then yes, I lose one more life cloth. But on the flip end, I just everything becomes easier for me for the rest of the game.
yeah, so effectively it was a stop too, and especially the Elric freeze is very relevant because of how reliant I am on Elric swings to push for damage, especially past invisible. So that was definitely like a effectively a two stop life burst turn.
Mm-hmm.
And then I still played well throughout. I got the full value of Burst Rush with the two Ferrin slashes. But towards the end of the game, I knew that I was at a very big disadvantage, mainly because I was down to one life cloth. I was not able to draw any servants, and I
Mm-hmm.
don't have very good servant draw. I have Kokoro as a fifth servant, but she was in trash at that time.
Mm-hmm.
So I had to make the difficult choice of whether to try to live one more turn somehow, which again, with one cloth, one assist stop with Toko, and no servants, I knew that was very unlikely. I knew I had to push for game. Um, I believe at that time I saw that you only had four Enter and Xenocluster was out.
Yep.
I believe you were down to two life cloth. So I calculated that if you can only stop two with invisible,
Mm-hmm.
and I can push for three damage as well as the two Elric swings. And I had my once per game up still at that time because I think you froze me previously and I did not choose to attack
Yeah,
that
you chose
turn.
not to attack. Yep.
Um, I knew that there was still a slight chance, depending on what your bursts were, that I could push through. But at that time, of course, you had full knowledge on your burst because I had moon knighted you earlier in that game.
Mm-hmm.
And so you had counted your burst and knew that there was still an opening signal and a extra type burst in your cloth.
Yep.
So you were comfortable to only grow your assist for one stop and rely on your burst to stop the rest of the damage, either by preventing my Elric from doing damage because I had no cards to pay for extra,
Mm-hmm.
or by banishing something that was upped with opening proxy. Both bursts would have kept you very healthy.
Yeah. So that's basically when I figured out like I potentially had the game. I knew going in with Miko that if I didn't go first, I was reliant on bursts to win that game, and I did get the bursts, and that's sort of how the game goes, how the shuffle works.
Of course.
But yeah, so when you moonlighted me and I saw I had so many bursts left, one of the bursts that then I refreshed was the extra burst. I was like, oh, this is amazing for me. If I hit that extra burst, I think I win this game 100% of the time. And I refreshed it. All right, it's now down to 50% again, but I,
Yeah,
I
I,
was I
I
was
did
much
refresh the
happier.
emergence out of your life cloth,
Yep. Yeah.
but there's still multiple bursts to go. So definitely, I still think that was the correct play that I made with the knowledge that I had available,
I think so.
where very unlikely that I live one more turn, even with a burst in my life cloth. Therefore, I need to push for damage and bet on you not having any bursts left or any relevant bursts and not having any servants in hand.
Yeah, because I could be lying. I could be when I'm looking at my trash so heavily, be like, oh yeah, I'm good to go, kind of thing, and just be like, yeah, I have all my bursts in my hand, I just
Mhm.
could be making some story up there. But you were definitely right to also wait on the tokoing, because I was actually when the turn that you were doing it, I was doing the math. I think I had six enter, used one for an extra, went down to five, went all right, so I can use two for a what do you call it, a love it to burn something. I have the Xenocluster in hand or in my Elrig deck, and you theoretically should give me an enter off of Toko, which would then put me at five, and I could very safely mel invisible. And you saw that and went, yeah, that's not good. I'm not falling into that trap, and you didn't kill the thing. So you played around it very, very well.
Yeah, if I recall, I believe Xeno Cluster was out at that time.
Hmm.
I think you learned from a previous game where you used Xeno early just to add to your ender to kind of keep your ender healthy
Hmm.
early on, especially because you're not going to be hurting for hand all that much unless you're really looking for servants.
Yep.
So um, I made my play based on the likelihood of me living one more turn and based on your ender. So I calculated gamble that did not pay off because your bursts were there.
Yeah, still totally the right choice. But still, congratulations, you made it to top four. Oh, then you guys you did have technically one more game, right? You had game against Chair after that.
Yes.
How did that one go? That was Nanashi, so it was your first time up against Nanashi for this tournament, right?
Yeah, honestly, at that point, both me and Cher were running on fumes, so we were both pretty tired. I played well throughout that game. I did get the full burst rush value again. But really, that game came down to was the final turn where I had three cloth left and a servant in hand, and he had opened all three lanes.
Hmm.
Um, I did another like risk assessment where he was on. Okay, let me think about this. So he was on for Enner.
Hmm.
I didn't want to Topo assist because that would put him at enough Enter to. Sorry, he was on three Enter. I didn't want to Toku assist because it would put him on four Enter. He
Hmm.
did already use Cluster at that time as well, but my worry was that he would pay for a two stop on Mel, and then if Emergence was on a stop cloth, he could pay for the Ange
Hmm.
once per game, and I needed that once per game to
Hmm. Hmm.
push for lethal that next turn if I got there. So we were also tired, and your game actually in first and second place had wrapped up, so I was a little bit impatient. I took a gamble by betting on three life burst, no, three life cloth to protect me and keep Toko and deny them an extra enter. Um, but really, this was only playing around an emergence being on the top cloth because if they pay for Null Invisible, but on a two enter, if I hit a cloth and it's emergence,
Hmm.
then he would have four enter and be able to pay for the ants once per game.
Hmm.
But the chances that were still very low, and I should have just used the ones or the Toko assist line to protect myself because I end up having no life burst on top.
Hmm.
They finally um, let me down at the very last moment, so it would have been safer to use Toko to assist, throw, stop a damage, and then I think because his servant draws is very poor, I did have the damage to end the game
Hmm.
if I just lived that turn.
Hmm.
So I attribute that to fatigue. It's a minor misplay that cost me third place and moving down to fourth.
Yeah.
Um, I'm not sure if that was like the full story for the end game state, but I did take a risk by not throwing Toko to deny one enter, and that mistake cost me that game. So out of the entirety of GP, I feel like that's my one and only misplay is a slight miscalculation in risk.
Sure. Yeah.
And that's kind of the name of the game with this deck, especially with Burst Rush, is um, you know, odds, chances, risks, and um didn't pay off that time. So that's just how the game goes.
Yeah, man, and it's tough to play literally ten rounds in basically a row and not run on fumes at the end. I definitely was running on fumes at the very end too.
It is
So
absolutely a marathon. Everybody in that tournament is a soldier for going through 7 rounds of Swiss, 40-minute time limits, just nonstop. It is a grind,
absolutely.
but also a blast at the same time.
Yeah.
So
There really is no better feeling than at least even making top eight. Once you make top eight, or at that point you can say, look, luck could kick in here. Everyone's a really good player. So, luck does matter a little bit here. But, making the top eight is always sort of like and locking it in, being like, all right, cool. I accomplished that. That's cool.
yep, for sure.
Well, anyways, Wilson, it was great having you on. This is where we're gonna get to the end. But do you have any shout outs that you wanna give before we do our sign off?
Um, I'll shout out my sister because I kept bringing her up throughout the tournament as one of my just primary motivators. I kept telling her that if I won, we were going to Japan next year, which was true, but I still plan to take her, so no worries about that. It may just be at a later date, but I'm not going to completely shut that off. I'm not going to deny her Disneyland because of that. But um, she gave me like some like good luck souvenirs as well when I left. So definitely play my part out with her in mind.
Yeah, and they worked. I mean, 6-1 is still a damn good accomplishment. And is there any chance that you might make it over to Dallas for the potential, coming back on it and then potentially go into Japan anyways?
Um, I'm strongly considering it, especially because I felt like I entered this Grand Prix with a degree of confidence,
Hmm.
that and my performance this tournament, getting fourth place and everything, um, kind of only increased my confidence.
Yeah.
Um, because there is definitely a luck factor, but I also like to think that there's a you can create your own luck as well. That you do have some control over the game. Um, that your mental state also has a big play into that. So if I do go to Dallas, I'm going there with the intention of winning it.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, when you said to me, "Yeah, I'm not," we both locked in top 8, but I'm still getting 7-0. I think that's the right mentality. I said the same thing to my testing partners. I went like, "Hey, you can get second place," and they were like, "Yeah, you can have the second place." We'd fight over it. But like, that's I think really important is confidence to know I've done all my work. My deck is strong. I'm a good player. I'm going to be able to push this. I am good enough to get there. I mean, a lot of people were saying even this for this format specifically. I heard a lot of jokes of if you go first, you win. And I went second in 6 of the rounds that I won. So I don't think that's true. I think there is a fair amount of things that you can do to create your own destiny too. And I think, yeah, you embodied that there. So I'd really love to see you at Dallas.
Yep. Um, Again, strongly considering it. But if I do, you better watch out.
Well, I think I might be easy pickings. I'm probably gonna play like some kind of deck like Bang at that point.
Yeah. Even still.
Well, man, it was great talking to you. And to do the sign off, well, I hope everyone subscribes to the Life Burst podcast. May you always flip a life first, and say subscribe for more great content like this to see how top players perform. Thank you again, Wilson, for joining.
Yep. Thanks so much for having me.
See you guys.